The crossbow was a weapon that changed everything in the Middle Ages. It was small, quiet, and powerful enough to pierce a knight's armor, which made it both feared and hated. It didn't require years of training like the longbow, and that made it dangerous in a different way. Any ordinary person could pick it up, learn it in a day, and kill a man who had spent his whole life preparing for war. It broke the balance of medieval warfare and challenged the idea of honor on the battlefield. That's why people said the crossbow was simply too good for its time, a weapon that belonged to the future, not the age of knights. Number 1. The upset nobody saw coming. The crossbow landed in a world built for armored professionals and cracked its logic in one clean click. Knights trained for years, paid fortunes for mail and plate, and expected respect to stop most threats. A crossbow ignored all of that. It let a shopkeeper or a porter send a short, heavy bolt straight through the weak spots that skill tried to hide. The real shock was not only power, it was access. A longbow asked for a lifetime of practice. A crossbow asked for a calm hand and a little coaching. Levers, belt hooks, and the simple stirrup did the heavy lifting. Windlasses and the geared cranachine turned raw force into a routine crank. The machine stored energy the body could not, then released it on demand. That put serious killing power into many more hands, and it did so fast. City governments understood the change before nobles did. Urban militias could equip dozens of gunners and get them competent by the next season. Workshops could standardize stocks, strings, and bolts. Pavis bearers marched with tall shields so shooters could kneel, wind, and fire in a steady rhythm. On walls and towers, the weapon was even more efficient. You could line up a shot from cover, breathe, and squeeze without a large draw motion that exposed your body. A single careful bolt could disrupt a ladder team or drop an officer and stall a push at a gate. Elites reacted because status was on the line. If a common soldier could drop a mounted knight at useful ranges, then pedigree lost value. Preachers called the weapon cruel and unchristian. The Lateran decree against using crossbows and archery on Christians showed how threatened the social order felt. Yet real war ignored the sermon. Commanders hired crossbowmen for sieges, field screens, and ship crews because the weapon worked. It punished rash advances. It shaped lanes of approach. It made cavalry think about timing instead of swagger. Armorers fought back with thicker breastplates and more curved surfaces. Visors narrowed. Mail underlayers improved. The arms race raised costs for those who could least afford constant upgrades. The crossbow kept pace because its logic was simple. Multiply force. Hold aim behind cover. Put a bolt where it counts. That combination flattened the battlefield more than any speech about honor could. It did not replace courage or discipline. It simply made them share space with mechanics, and that was the upset no one at the top wanted to see. Number 2. Mechanics that cheated biology. The crossbow was one of the smartest inventions of the Middle Ages because it used simple mechanics to overcome the limits of the human body. A person's arm can only pull a bowstring with a certain amount of strength. Muscles shake, they get tired, and accuracy drops fast. The crossbow solved that problem by storing energy in the weapon itself instead of relying on muscle power. The shooter didn't have to be strong. The weapon did the hard work. The main part of a crossbow is the prod, which is the small bow fixed horizontally on a wooden stock. Early versions were made of wood, but as technology advanced, people started using composite materials like horn and sinew, and later steel. The stronger the material, the more energy the crossbow could hold. A heavy steel prod could store several hundred pounds of tension. That kind of power was impossible for a person to pull with a regular bow. But the crossbow used clever tools to handle it. Soldiers could use a stirrup, a belt hook, or even mechanical devices like a goat's foot lever or a crank called a windlass. With those tools, anyone could load a weapon that hit with enormous force. The trigger system was another breakthrough. A small rotating nut held the string in place and released it when the shooter pressed the lever. That meant every shot had the same draw length and the same release point. The result was consistent accuracy. You could aim slowly, breathe, and fire when ready. It didn't take years of training like the English longbow. A farmer could learn to shoot a crossbow in a day. That was revolutionary for medieval armies because it allowed them to quickly train large groups of soldiers who could actually hit targets. The bolts, or quarrels, were short and heavy. They didn't fly as far as arrows, but they carried much more energy. Against armor, they were devastating. A well-made crossbow at close range could pierce chainmail or even dent steel plate. That terrified knights who were used to feeling nearly invincible on the battlefield. The crossbow could punch through their defenses with a single shot. The weapon's design also made it practical in more situations. On castle walls, soldiers could stay behind cover, load safely, and fire with precision. On ships, where movement was constant, the crossbow's stability made it perfect for close-range naval combat. In city defenses, militias could use them effectively without needing full-time warriors. The reason people said the crossbow was too good for the Middle Ages is because it made killing too easy. It didn't care about strength, status, or noble training. It turned warfare into something mechanical and efficient. That scared the elite, but it was exactly why armies loved it. The crossbow replaced muscle with mechanics and changed forever how people thought about power, skill, and war. Number 3. Tactics that bent the battlefield. The crossbow completely changed how battles were fought in the Middle Ages. Before it appeared, wars were often decided by cavalry charges, shield walls, and personal duels between knights. But the crossbow introduced a new kind of logic. It rewarded patience, teamwork, and timing instead of brute strength or noble skill. A well-trained crossbow team could stop a cavalry charge that would once have crushed ordinary infantry. Commanders quickly learned to build whole systems around these weapons. Crossbowmen usually worked in groups. They didn't fight alone. Each shooter had helpers who carried extra bolts, set up large shields called pavises, and reloaded if needed. These tall shields acted like mobile cover. Soldiers could kneel behind them, load the weapon safely, then step out to shoot before hiding again. It turned battle into a rhythm fire, reload, advance, fire again. Against charging knights, this rhythm was deadly. The bolts often hit horses first, breaking formations and throwing riders into confusion. Once the enemy was dismounted, regular infantry or pikemen could finish the job easily. During sieges, crossbows were even more important. Defenders placed crossbowmen along the walls and towers, giving them the perfect height advantage. From there, they picked off attackers, climbing ladders, or pushing siege towers. One accurate shot could kill a commander or an engineer and stop an entire section of the assault. Attackers used them too. They brought their own crossbowmen to cover workers, filling moats or building siege engines. Both sides used wooden barriers, wheeled shields, and thick walls of hay to block incoming bolts. It became a deadly game of angles and patience, where every small mistake could cost a life. Crossbows also played a huge role in city battles. Medieval towns had narrow streets and stone houses, perfect for ambushes. Soldiers fired from windows or rooftops where they were almost impossible to reach. A single crossbowman could hold an alley and stop a whole squad of enemies from advancing. That's why many medieval cities had laws against walking around with a loaded crossbow. It was too dangerous in close quarters. Even at sea, crossbows proved useful. Sailors used them because the weapon stayed accurate even when the deck was moving. You could aim between waves and still hit your target. Early naval battles often started with a volley of bolts before ships came close enough for boarding. In short, the crossbow forced everyone to rethink how war worked. It made courage alone useless if it wasn't supported by smart tactics. Soldiers had to learn teamwork, patience, and positioning. The weapon gave small groups the power to hold ground against stronger forces. It turned medieval warfare from raw chaos into something more calculated and tactical. Number 4. Status, ethics, and the price on a bolt. The crossbow rattled the social ladder because it handed real killing power to people who were not nobles or lifelong professionals. A trained knight carried the symbols of rank on his body, from a polished helm to layered mail and plate. A city artisan with a crossbow could threaten that investment from behind a wooden shield and a wall, which felt like a direct insult to status and tradition. Preachers and chroniclers called the weapon cruel and unchristian because it made distance do the work and turned combat into a choice of timing instead of a test of courage. Church leaders even tried to fence it out of Christian on Christian war, which shows how deeply it cut across the idea of honorable violence in the age. The moral debate never stopped armies from hiring specialists, because commanders followed results. Italian and Mediterranean cities built reputations on professional crossbow units that came with drills, support crews, and the big pavis shields that made the whole system work. These shooters were valuable on land and at sea, where a steady rest and clear sight lines mattered more than noise or show. The men were not cheap, and that price signaled their standing inside a force. A captain with disciplined crossbowmen could shape a battlefield by denying approaches, punishing cavalry, and picking officers off towers and ladders. City life adjusted around the danger. Urban militias trained on feast days and competed for prizes, which tied civic pride to reliable defense. Guilds handled equipment standards, storage, and turnout, and that organization turned ordinary townsmen into a credible reserve. The same communities wrote rules about where and when a loaded crossbow could appear in public, because one bolt from a window could end a quarrel or start a riot. The weapon sat on the fine line between public order and sudden murder, and cities managed that risk with bylaws, inspections, and drill. Money explains the rest. A knight's armor and trained horse consumed wealth for years, while a municipality could buy crossbows in batches and teach use on a short timeline. Wages and supply still mattered. Good strings had to be waxed and kept dry. Bolts had to be fletched, tipped, and counted. A corps needed pavis bearers and porters to keep the rhythm of fire, which raised contracts and pay scales, but still undercut the lifetime cost of elite cavalry. Armorers reacted by thickening plates and sharpening curves, yet one well-aimed quarrel still found eyes, joints, and luck. The medical world noticed too. Surgeons wrote about the tools and techniques for pulling arrow and bolt heads, which tells you how common and feared these wounds were. A single peasant's shot killed a king, and that story kept the fear alive long after the body cooled. Number 5. The day it became yesterday. The crossbow didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because something even easier came along. For hundreds of years, it had been the great equalizer. It gave ordinary soldiers the chance to stand against knights who had trained since childhood. But by the late Middle Ages, a new invention started taking over the battlefield. That invention was gunpowder. Once guns appeared, the clock started ticking for the crossbow. Early firearms were slow, heavy, and not very accurate. They often failed in the rain, and the noise was terrifying even for the people firing them. But they had one major advantage. Anyone could learn to use one. Loading and shooting a gun took less time to learn than winding a heavy crossbow. You didn't need strength or training. That simplicity changed everything. Armies could now recruit huge numbers of soldiers, give them basic training, and send them to war much faster than before. Governments quickly realized that guns could be made faster and cheaper than crossbows. A good crossbow needed skilled craftsmen. It required strong steel for the prod, good wood for the stock, and proper tools to assemble it. Guns, on the other hand, could be produced in large batches with iron barrels and a few simple mechanisms. Once mass production started, the economics of war shifted. It became easier to arm an army with firearms than with crossbows. Armor also started losing its purpose. A well-made crossbow bolt could pierce most armor at close range, but a musket ball could do it from much farther away. Knights, who had once been nearly invincible, found their armor useless against gunfire. They could no longer charge into battle confident that their steel plates would save them. This marked the end of the medieval knight as a dominant figure on the battlefield. Still, the crossbow didn't vanish overnight. In many towns and villages, it remained a trusted weapon for hunting and defense. It was quiet, easy to maintain, and deadly accurate. Hunters liked it because it didn't scare away animals like gunshots did. Some guards and sailors kept crossbows as backup weapons, especially when gunpowder was expensive or unreliable. But in real wars, the crossbow was slowly pushed aside. By the 1500s, gunpowder had completely taken over. Muskets and cannons ruled the field. Warfare became louder, faster, and much more destructive. Yet, the crossbow's influence never truly went away. It had already changed how people thought about fighting. It proved that a simple mechanical idea could break centuries of tradition and shift power from the elite to the common soldier. The moment that happened, the medieval world began to fade. The crossbow had done its job too well, and the world moved on to the next step. It was, in every sense, too good for its own time.